Welcome to the Living Room Disciple Podcast. Look, I can't wait to share my interview guest today, but quick story. You see, this past Christmas, my wife gave me this amazing box set. This is a translation and commentary of the Hebrew Bible, and it has been a huge blessing to me and my learning. And the author is Dr. Robert Alter. He has been a professor at Berkeley since 1967, and he's both a Hebraist. He translates the Hebrew language into English, as well as studying and helping other people understand Hebrew narrative and poetic structure. And it's that crossover that has really helped me or drawn me to his work. And I am incredibly excited to introduce you all to him today as he is our guest. So let's get right into the conversation on the Living Room Disciple Podcast, where discipleship finds a home. Dr. Alter, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. And I was just about to tell you before we hit record that one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk to you is because your academic background, which is extensive, kind of has a very, in my opinion, very interesting overlap. And correct me if I'm wrong here, between understanding narrative and understanding translation for what many believers would call the Old Testament text or the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. Would you say that's an accurate kind of overlap?
Yeah. My formal training, although I've read biblical Hebrew since my late teens, my formal training is all in comparative literature, in modern literatures, English, French, and modern Hebrew. And the story is that I was always fascinated by biblical narrative, and these seem to me astonishing stories. But I couldn't really figure out, because they were so spare, why they were so great. And then about 15 years into my career, I thought, well, maybe I have a couple of ideas. So I wrote one article, which I thought was going to be a one-off, on the need for a literary perspective on the Bible. And it got quite a response. So I thought, okay, I have another couple of ideas. I'll write a second article. And one thing led to the next. And after, I don't know, half a year or so, I found that I was on my way to writing The Art of Biblical Narrative. And I thought I would
Which is your first major landmark work, isn't it correct?
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. So I thought I'd stop with that. But that was very well received. So I thought, well, why not a book on the art of biblical poetry? And by that time, I was going down the slippery slope into biblical studies, and really combining my literary interests with my biblical interests.
And I think that's why your work inspires me or gets me so excited, because my own background is in English literature and understanding literature. And I came to faith, kind of around that time. And so I kind of, it actually wasn't until recently, I've been a Christian for 15 years now, but it wasn't until recently until I really became convicted. I was like, man, the Bible is a story. And even though I feel like that's common language, it's not common practice to read the Bible as story.
Yeah.
And to begin to see narrative through lines through specifically the Old Testament text. And I think for me, one of the difficulties, and this is where I'd love to kind of begin diving deeper into our conversation. So I've been leveraging resources from the Bible Project for some time now. And in fact, it was in a class from the Bible Project. One of the students asked the teacher, Dr. Tim Mackey, where could we get a translation that helps us understand and see some of these through lines that we're learning about? And he recommended your translation, which is how I got onto it. So huge shout out to you there. But it wasn't until later in my walk, when I'm really learning and understanding that there's imagery, for example, in the Garden of Eden, that because of like the Hebrew words or phrases is repeated imagery that is drawn upon consistently throughout the Hebrew Bible. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And well, here's the thing about picking up how the biblical narrative is shaped as literature. It, of course, has a religious purpose. I
Mm-hmm.
don't deny that for a moment. But for reasons that we can't really fathom, this rather we talk about the glories of ancient Israel, but in the big picture of the ancient Near East, um, ancient Israel was the boondocks. It was this little
Mm-hmm.
sliver of land sandwiched in between these mighty empires, Assyria and then Babylon to the east, and Egypt to the south. Empires that had magnificent art and architecture and sculpture, as anyone who's walked through the ancient Near Eastern division of a great museum. The best one to go to is the British Museum in London. Knows that. Whereas, in terms of the material culture of ancient Israel, it was kind of rudimentary. There was nothing astounding about the architecture. The visual representations we have of human figures are pretty much stick figures.
Mm.
Yet this small and in some ways backward culture produced writers of genius
Mm-hmm.
whose work far eclipsed everything in the surrounding cultures. I mean, Gilgamesh is, a really
Mm-hmm.
interesting narrative poem, but it doesn't begin to compare with the David story or with the patriarchal tales in Genesis. And we will never know why it is that these writers decided to convey their vision of monotheism in highly sophisticated, subtle literary form. But they did. Now, let me say just one more thing. I don't want to
Okay.
hold forth too long. Uh, so, why hasn't it been seen over the ages? Well, Christians and Jews, of course, regarded the Bible as a source of wisdom, of
Mm-hmm.
theological truth, of moral instruction.
Mm-hmm.
And they began to look past the literary dimension of it, and then a kind of cultural amnesia set in. That is,
Mm.
for example, in the narrative, and I could give us some examples if you want to explore that. The there are very sophisticated narrative conventions and techniques that the Hebrew writers developed,
Yeah,
and
give us like
not seen
one
those.
common one, or like one easier to grasp for somebody who maybe isn't like a Hebrew scholar.
Okay, well, there's a lot of repetition
Mm-hmm.
in the Hebrew narratives, which at first blush is surprising because it's such an economical kind of narrative. And very often you have a setup where um, character X says something, and then character Y reports what X said to
Mm-hmm.
Z. And he
Which for modern
uses,
readers is so boring. Like, why would
right.
they do that?
Well, here's the thing, it really isn't boring if you learn to look at it. Because what happens is that in what looks like absolute repetition, there's almost always a swerve away from the verbatim. And that swerve opens up a window of meaning. I'll give you a very simple example. When Potiphar's wife accuses Joseph of attempted rape, she says of her husband, not even referring to him by name or by my husband, but just he. Look, he brought us a Hebrew man to dally with us or to mock us. It has a sexual meaning, but also just means to mock. And she's talking to the household staff. When her husband comes home, she gives him the same report in verbatim repetition, except instead of saying a Hebrew man, she says a Hebrew slave. So what's going on? The writer is keenly aware of whom is being addressed. When she's talking to the household workers, they are almost certainly slaves. So she doesn't want to remind them of the solidarity as slaves between them and Joseph. So she says, a Hebrew man, implying maybe as a recent political candidate who I will not name said that all Mexicans are rapists. You know, all those crazy Hebrews from up
kind of
north,
emphasizing the ethnicity issue,
coming
right?
down
Or
to rape our
issue. So,
women. Now, when she turns to her husband, she substitutes, just a one word substitute, she substitutes slave for man, because to her husband, she wants to remind him that you're a slave, a creature who is your property, had the audacity to try to assault me. So you see, what looks like boring repetition is alert with meaning. And that happens again and again.
And I think the fact that it happens again and again, for me, so I can hold up here. So this is the first. This is the Law of Moses. This is a part of your amazing translation of the Hebrew Bible, which I can't recommend to our listeners enough. This is my most exciting Christmas gift, and this is just one part of it. And so I'm working slowly through the Book of Genesis using your translation. And one of the things that's sticking out to me, in fact, I'll even jump over to it. You're referring to this moment where, Yahweh looks at those who are building the Tower of Babel. And there's this little line that says, come let us. And as a part of that, you talk about the word language in this section occurs 5 times in this brief text, as does the phrase all the earth. And the land of Shinar is the same Hebrew word as that of earth. The prose, and you say this, the prose turns language itself into a game of mirrors. Is this what you're talking about when you talk about repetition?
Yeah, this is a somewhat different kind of repetition. Well, back a century ago in Germany, Martin Buber, of course, became famous as a religious thinker, and Franz Rosenzweig set out to do a new German translation of the Bible. And one of the things that they discovered, I think it was a real discovery, is that the biblical narrative, this is another technique. It uses what they called Leitwörter, which means leading words. That is that term that they invented was coined on the model of leitmotif in Wagnerian music, in Wagner's operas.
Okay.
And what they propose, and this turns out to be completely convincing, is that as stories unfold, there are certain, maybe the easiest way to call it in English is key words. There are certain key words that recur, and they define the theme of the story. Sometimes they occur and their meanings switch, or there's a play on two different meanings of the word. So in the Tower of Babel, which was a very compact narrative, it's just half of one chapter in early Genesis. What constitutes language and how language, according to this story, split apart is the main theme, and so language, words, keeps recurring in that story.
I want to ask you, I think, a really important question for our listeners, because I guess I don't have a good answer for it, and I need help.
Yeah.
Dr. Alter, take a normal American modern day, reader of the Bible, religious or not. They come in and they pick up just the normal translation that was offered to them, NIV, NLT, ESV, and they read through. They open the Bible to Genesis 1:1, and they just start reading.
Mm-hmm.
What are they likely going to miss from the narrative structure of the text because they're not reading the original language, or because of common translation choices? What are some of the difficulties and challenges they may have, and what are some of the things that you expect them to miss?
Well, the main thing is this. The various modern translations of the Bible, which most of them were done in the second half of the 20th century by committees composed of ecclesiastical authorities and scholars. And these people had excellent credentials. The scholars had degrees in this country in biblical studies from Harvard and Yale and the University of Chicago and so forth. And in England, of course, from Oxford and Cambridge. So they knew their scholarly P's and Q's, that they knew their philology. But if you do a PhD in any of those august institutions in biblical studies, you will never take a course in narrative technique in the Bible, in prose style, in Hebrew narrative, and so forth. So they looked right past it. They didn't see it. And they proceeded under the illusion that they were making the Bible more accessible to pretty much erase, I would say, at least 75% of the literary finesse of the Bible. Well, I'll give you one example. I'll go back to my bit about repetition and variation. In the book of Samuel, there's a civil war between the house of Saul is already dead, and the house of David. And after a lot of bloodshed, Saul, the house of Saul's general, Abner, decides he's ready to make peace with David. And he comes to David's provisional capital in Hebron, and they have a meal together and then negotiate an agreement. And the Hebrew works like this. And he sent him off, the first he being David, the second one being Abner. He sent him off and he went in peace. And then Joab, David's military commander, who has a vendetta against Abner and also doesn't want to be replaced by Abner, comes back from a sortie with some of his troops and they report him, Abner was here and David sent him off and he went in peace. And I think that's repeated a third time, the exact same words. Then uh, Joab, in a rage, confronts David and says, why did you send Abner off and he went going off? The peace evaporates. And you have this ominous going off. And in fact, what Joab will proceed to do is ambush Abner by the roadside and stab him to death.
So it's a foreshadowing technique almost.
That's foreshadowing. And it's very effective and subtle foreshadowing, as you can see. Now, I've looked at several modern translations. They all erase the repetition. They think, well, you don't want to repeat things because they're boring.
Yes.
They're not at all boring when you have an eye to the swerve from the verbatim. So, alas, an innocent reader reading the New English Bible or the Jewish Publication Society translation or a couple of others will never see this because it's been erased by the translation.
I can imagine somebody saying, but Dr. Alter, does it really matter? It doesn't affect the story, right? The events still unfold as the events. The plot is still the plot. So why does, if it makes it easier for me to read, or why does it matter?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, first of all, it does make it a less interesting story.
I do agree with that.
You don't have this ominous, and he sent him going off like that. And there are hundreds of instances like this with repetition and variation in the Bible. But secondly, it often obscures, how should I put it, the social or dramatic location of the speakers in the dialogue. And I'll stick again with the example that I gave to start with, Joseph
wife.
and Potiphar's wife. Now, if you don't notice, and if the translation, in fact, obscures the difference between an Egyptian man and an Egyptian slave, then you're not picking up the social interaction first between Potiphar's wife and the household workers, second between Mrs. Potiphar and Mr. Potiphar.
One of the things too, and not that I want to dive into theology and doctrine, but I have been noticing that, when we're making translation choices, oftentimes we vary words or we adjust the meaning of a Hebrew word depending on the context around the word, and I think that makes sense. But I was doing a word study the other day, and I'd love for you to fact check me here, because I was looking in Genesis 2, and there's this word, I'm confident I cannot pronounce it correctly, but it's when Yahweh creates Eve. It's the word that is often translated helper.
Oh, yeah, that's a hard one. It's hard to translate.
Is it Azur? Is that how you say it? How do you say it?
Azer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's this term Azer, and I think the reason that it stuck out to me, because I was doing the word study, this is really early on in me starting to try to dabble in the original language, and I am very far away from a scholar. And I did a word study, and everywhere else, I believe that it appeared in the Old Testament text and in the Hebrew Bible, that word was used in reference to Yahweh and Yahweh's relationship to Israel. And this is where I'm kind of getting at. It's interesting because I think a lot of times the faith tradition that many of us come from would view the word used in the original Genesis context as this submissive role that Eve is kind of brought into, right? Be the helper of Adam. But because we oftentimes do not translate these future words, helper, in the same context, we might translate ally or something to that context. It's almost like, based on what I'm beginning to learn about the authors, they would have used that word intentionally. So the word that they would use to try to explain Yahweh's relationship in the psalm or whatever it is to Israel was intentionally the same word that Yahweh used to describe what he was creating for Adam. Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah. That I hadn't really thought much about that, but that's quite possible. I'd have to check a Hebrew concordance to see if it's predominantly the kind of help that God extends to Israel. It comes a lot in the Psalms, and in the Psalms, it's often someone in great plight asking God for help, or an affirmation that uh, God is on my side in a military conflict. Whether that's relevant to the creation of Eve, possibly, but I'm not sure.
I feel like this is the closest I'm ever going to get to
Yeah,
feeling really
and,
intelligent in a room with
and
you.
it's the whole. It's part of a two-word designation of the role that Eve is to fulfill, um, and the other word is a preposition, which means alongside him or opposite him, maybe just with him, but it doesn't appear anywhere else. So I found it a kind of challenge to come up with a happy English equivalent. And I have to say this as a translator of the Bible, although there are many delightful moments when you feel you've hit the nail on the head, there are others where you can't think of anything in English that works the way the Hebrew does. And so you come up with something that's a kind of compromise, and it might be a compromise that makes you, as a translator, less than happy.
Is that the biggest challenge that you face as a translator? Words that just have no real equivalent?
Yeah, that's one. I'm going to suggest two challenges. One is, if you look at the semantic map of biblical Hebrew, it doesn't map neatly onto the semantic map of modern English. So there are
Explain a
words,
semantic map to me. What do you mean by that?
the terms we use in our native languages are the way we map out reality, the way we define relationships, roles, missions, and so forth. And okay. Let me take one of my favorite challenges, because it illustrates how the disparity between the two languages. There is a Hebrew word that's used all over the place, nephesh. Now, nefesh traditionally is translated as soul, S-O-U-L. And I think that starts with the Vulgate, which translated as anima. The sticky thing is that in the biblical world, I know this will shock some of your listeners, there was no equivalent concept of soul, because
I've heard
they
this.
they didn't think of a body-soul split.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Hebrew Bible, this changes, of course. It changes for Jews, not just Christians. Uh, there was no notion of a soul surviving after death.
Mm-hmm.
So the word that's represented as soul uh, actually means breath or
Mm-hmm.
life breath. So when Judah says of his father and Benjamin, his nephesh, that is his father's nephesh, is bound up in Benjamin's nephesh.
Mm.
His whole life is tied up with the kid's life.
Yeah, his very existence.
Yeah. So,
Mm.
yeah, right. But then it gets more. So often I translate it as life or even life breath. Um, but then it gets complicated. Um, when it's in the first person singular, biblical verbs are declined according to person and number. So you say, my nefesh. And my nefesh means something like me, the essential me.
Mm.
It's an intensive form of the first person pronoun. We don't have anything like that in
Yeah.
English. Then, okay, it gets still more complicated. But by extension, well, by what's called by us literary types, metonymy, that is, comparing two terms because they're in contact.
Mm.
Uh, and nefesh can also mean throat or neck, because the throat is the
Mm.
passageway for the life breath. So when the King James Version says, water has come up uh, even unto my soul, which you wonder what kind of spiritual plumbing that is. Actually, what the psalmist is saying is, water has come up to my
To my
neck.
throat.
I'm
Yeah.
drowning. Uh,
Yeah.
so, as much as I like to translate use the same English term with this for the same Hebrew term with nefesh, I couldn't possibly do it. I had to keep, and there are other meanings of nefesh, but I think I've tormented that one enough.
I don't think I definitely wouldn't call it tormenting. But really what you're saying, and I think this is important, and this is one of the biggest revelations I've had over the last 2 or 3 years. You're not just translating words to words. You're trying to bridge cultures, because the language we use both shapes the culture we live in and is a reflection of the culture we live in. So we have plenty of words, spirit, soul, that try to give us an understanding that generally the modern spiritual understanding across various different religious viewpoints, and even a religious viewpoints, is that there's a consciousness or spiritual element to a person, and there is their physical body, and these are
Right.
separated, and our language easily reflects that, and that's the assumption that we make of other cultures and other peoples throughout time. So when you're coming in as a translator, you're now faced with words where they kind of did for throat what we kind of do for heart, where we kind of indicate heart like emotion, or it's
Right.
both a bodily organ and it's like has this
Sure.
spiritual kind of sense. And they just did the same thing, that they have that your whole essence and being is represented in this word nefesh. And well, obviously this physical, which actually makes more sense for the record than just some part in my chest. But anyways, this thing where like, if this isn't working, if this isn't attached, if this
Right.
is like,
They're fit.
it's,
Right.
yeah, it's a very logical, I think, when you think about it from that perspective.
Yeah, you see these police procedurals where there's a body on the floor, and the detective comes in, and the first thing he does is he feels the neck for a pulse.
The nefesh. Yeah. And so that does sound like a really difficult challenge that is being faced by translators. So translating words to words and then translating cross-culturally.
Right. If I could
Yeah.
pick up what you're saying, certain things. Well, for example, the Hebrew writer's sense of spirituality was not quite. It didn't quite work in the same way that ours did. It's a different culture,
Mm-hmm.
and basically, they had a vision of spirituality that was anchored in the body, in the human body. And I'll give you one example where I think I'm the only person who translated this way, but I'm almost positive it's right. In one of the Psalms, somewhere in the 60s, maybe 63, I'm not sure, the speaker says, um, the traditional translation, my soul, as nefesh, my soul thirsted for you, O God,
Mm.
in a parched land without water.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look at the parched land without water, you can see that even though my soul thirsted for you, God, is beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
I'm almost sure what the psalmist was saying was, my throat thirsted for you in a parched land without water, which maybe
Mm.
is less elegant than soul, but it has a kind of powerful immediacy that is the speaker so longs for God that he imagined himself um, wandering through a desert under the blazing sun in the Near East and desperate for water, and he's desperate for God in the same way.
And wouldn't it be possible to say that he meant, and this is what we do with the English language all the time, it's a play on words and it means both things. It's saying like my longing for you is like having a parched throat. Like it's like dying of thirst, but it's not just my throat, it's my whole being is like that. It
Oh,
wouldn't,
that's possible, sure.
you know, and I think that's the sophistication of the literary form that your work and other work has kind of helped me begin to like open my eyes to, that this is incredibly sophisticated literature.
Hmm.
And I just zoom by it, or I have been zoom buying it, for like a decade, honestly getting bored more often than I'd like to admit. Just like, I don't know. Um, and now I'm kind of awakening to this excitement that there's so much going on here. And for our listeners, maybe this is a bit of a rabbit trail. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. There's almost this beauty. It draws out to me the meditative qualities of the biblical literature.
Hmm.
That I think this makes it too trite, but I do think this is true to some extent. It's a puzzle at times that is only unlocked or solved, and I don't think it's really solved, but it's when your mind just ponders it. It's almost like the benefit is less about the quick read and the more of the soaking it in.
Oh,
um
yeah.
mhm. And I think that's true of modern day literature. We have airport literature that's like read it quickly, forget
Yeah,
about
of
it, but
course.
then we have the classics, right? The great books that you come back to in time and time again because there's so much meat on the bone there, as it
Right.
were. And I think that's one of the things that your work has kind of helped me unlock in the Hebrew Bible specifically. And I'm really, really grateful for that. So thank you.
Yeah, I would say this about my own experience in reading the Hebrew Bible, that as I got into it more deeply, long before I had any notion of translating the Bible, but I was already working on biblical narrative. The more I looked at it, the more I started seeing things that I had never noticed and things that were sometimes quite amazing.
Mm.
And even now, in the last few years, now I've recently finished the draft of a short book on this topic. I began to notice how important dialogue is in
Mm.
Hebrew narrative, and and it began to dawn on me that this is a kind of dialogue that doesn't exist anywhere else in ancient literature. I don't know. Maybe I don't know Chinese ancient literature or Indian, so maybe there are exceptions there. Although I kind of doubt it.
Mm.
Uh, and what I started realizing was that the virtually unique anticipation of novelistic dialogue is in ancient Hebrew narrative.
Mm. What do you
Where
mean by that?
why do I say that?
Yeah, what do you mean by that? What does that mean?
Well, I mean the language is shaped to reflect the speaker's relationship to his or her
Mm.
interlocutor, as with Potiphar's
Hmm.
wife in that example that I gave, and it often reflects the psychology uh, or the character of the speaker.
Mm.
And in order to do this, see, one important thing: these are narratives written in prose.
Hmm.
Now, there are very few narratives in early culture that are in prose. The typical
Mm.
form is poetry. Gilgamesh is poetry, Homer is poetry, Hesiod is poetry, and so forth.
Hmm.
If you're writing in poetry, let's say if you're Homer and everything is dactylic hexameter, that particular meter that
Hmm.
he uses, and the lang this even though there are eloquent speeches for sure in Homer, in both the Odyssey and the Iliad, they're speeches. They're not really dialogue. There's not that kind of give and take of dialogue. It's not what you would find in a novel by Faulkner or Hemingway or Virginia Woolf
Mm.
or whomever. And but the Hebrew writers did this, and they didn't hesitate at times to bend the language in order to remain true to the character and to the narrative situation. I'll give you an extreme example.
Okay.
In Absalom's rebellion against David, despite the fact that his son Absalom has usurped the throne and wants to kill him, he doesn't want any harm to come to Absalom.
Hmm. It's
So
his son.
it says, deal in I think the quite beautiful translation of the King James Version, which I followed here, deal gently with the lad Absalom.
Mm.
So uh, the battle takes place. David is enjoined by his troops to stay back in this fortified city of Machanaim, and uh, the forces of David prevail, and Joab, who realizes that despite David's instructions, it would be dangerous to keep Absalom around. Joab is
He has a tendency to do this.
yeah, he's a ruthless practitioner of realpolitik. So he sees to it that Absalom is killed.
Mm.
And then uh, somebody, one of the priests that's in David's on David's side wants to rush to bring the news from the battlefield to David, and Joab tries to talk him out of it, but he says, "No, no, I got to do this." So he goes sprinting across the plain, uh, arrives at Mahanaim, tells David that his forces have prevailed over the rebels' forces. And then David says, is the kid all right? He says, actually, the Hebrew is quite beautiful. He says, Hashalom lanar av shalom. It is all well with the lad Absalom, but you have that play on Av Shalom and Shalom. And at that point, the messenger starts to babble. He speaks these incoherent sentences, like maybe two sentences, and then he breaks off in the middle. Now, all the translations before mine figure, well, it's the Bible, it has to make sense. So they clean up what he says and make it coherent. But this is true dialogue. The messenger is scared to tell David that his son has been killed.
So you might be remembering the messenger who told him about Saul. So this is, as far as you know, perhaps one of the first texts, and which is really interesting because you have multiple authors spread over, how many years would you say the Hebrew Bible was written over?
Well, if you look at everything in the Hebrew, it's really an anthology.
Yes.
It spans 8 or 9 centuries.
So 800 or 900 years. And this is really some of the first texts that we see from a civilization that is using dialogue that's a close approximation of the type of dialogue that we'd be writing in our modern text today, which you had made this point earlier, and I think it's really good to come back to because some people might be like, okay, but why does that matter? Paper is not cheap, and writing is not a common, and being able to translate, like, this is every decision to repeat means that there is not just a decision based on one author, but a collective decision by a bunch of people to invest time, money, and energy into that repetition, into this types of dialogue. And it meant that they felt there was real value to every single word, because it wasn't somebody just typing and hitting send on an email, and I think we take that for granted. Like, that was really important, which might be why Gilgamesh, the Iliad, these things are written in poetry. It's more economical. It's easier to remember. It's easier to carry on it orally versus writing it down. And this backwater, what do you say, boondocks earlier? Like, that in many other ways and forms of art and architecture is not sophisticated, chooses this type of literature to dive headfirst into. It really is remarkable.
Yeah, it is. And there's some things in the history of cultures that are just mysteries. Like, why is it that in England, toward the end of the 16th century and into the first 2 decades of the 17th century, you had this astonishing cluster of literary geniuses, not only Shakespeare, but Spencer and Ben Jonson and John Donne and so forth. And people say, well, it's because of the success of British imperialism, but that doesn't seem to be a very convincing explanation. It just happened miraculously.
Yeah, I do agree with you. Even if certain things like British imperialism, contributed to the widespread consummation of their work, the brilliance of their work, and I think you see that too in Europe, in Germany specifically, with composers, musical composers.
Right.
Again, like, just absolute geniuses. But I don't know. I think we're still talking, those are often still the hubs of civilization at the time, and Israel was not.
It was not. That's right.
And I think that's where it stands out. And again, I'm not an expert on world history, and I don't want to pretend to be, but I think that's where it stands out as even more remarkable to me. And
Yes, I agree entirely.
yeah, I really do want to bug you for much more of your time. And so maybe we'll have you come back at some point to talk specifically about narrative, because I haven't read your book on biblical narrative yet, but it's on my list. And I can't wait to dive into it. So, but Dr. Alter, thank you so much for your time this evening. Thank you so much for joining me and Dr. Alter on our conversation today. For me, his work has really helped me understand the Hebrew Bible narrative, that Old Testament narrative. And for me, that's created both a deeper understanding of who God is, and therefore a deeper understanding of the New Testament texts and what the Gospels are teaching me and what the kingdom is like and what the epistles are instructing me to do. What I'm trying to say is, as I understand biblical narrative in the language and the audience it was intended for, I better understand the person of Jesus and how to follow him better. And that's why I think conversations like this are really important, and why academic work like this is so important. So if this interests you, I would absolutely recommend checking out Dr. Alter's work, specifically his translation of the Hebrew Bible, which is our Old Testament. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Thank you to Anissa Live for all the production work, to Eric Church for getting this episode out there, and to Daniel Ramirez for his amazing composition of our music. And thank you to you for sticking around to the end, and also for listening and supporting our podcast. It means the world. This is the Living Room Disciple Podcast, where discipleship finds a home.